Welcome to the Next Time podcast. My name is Sundar. I lead the forensic services at Next Time. This podcast is part of Global Anti-Corruption series. Our podcast is an endeavor to bring up emerging topics of relevance for executives across spectrum of services we offer. Hope you enjoy the podcast. Across the geographies, regulatory environments are changing, business practices are changing, and behaviors are changing with COVID. Anti-corruption in current environment is bringing newer dimensions with issues around supply chain, healthcare, and other reporting requirements. This also extends to regulatory interventions and the whole new virtual world. In this podcast, we will be interviewing specialists across the regions to gather specific insights on anti-corruption in current times. The region that would get covered today is India. We have with us Alina Arora, a senior partner dealing with white-collar crime in Shardul Amachand, India's leading law firm. She works on matters involving internal investigation, anti-bribery corruption reviews, involving companies in India, including subsidiaries of foreign multinationals. She is here to share insights on anti-corruption in current times in Indian context. Alina, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Alina, I just wanted to start that the 90 days have been really different for us. There's a lot of changes from government stimulus packages, changes in the business environment, lockdown, relaxation, and healthcare focus as such. How do you perceive corruption risks in the current environment?
So I would say that in the Indian context, first and foremost, as far as the corruption index is concerned, India has always been seen as a high-risk country. It's probably, I think, in the transparency index at about number 80. And so to say, we have been suspect and susceptible to various kinds of frauds and corruption issues that have been coming up time and again. And while there have been significant trends, changes, legislative changes coming about to improve ethics, compliance, and anti-corruption strategy to bring us to the developing country standards, I think there is a lot more to be done. What has happened because of this pandemic, Sundar, is everything has changed for us. I think this is unprecedented times where most of the Indian companies are probably not adept to working in the manner that they have been required to, let's just say, re-strategize the way they do business. There is been significant number of lockdowns, reopenings, lockdowns again, and multiple restrictions in terms of interstate movement, logistics supports, public transport issues, factories being closed, labor legislations being amended, standards being introduced by the government to restart business. Now, what all of this is done with so many changes happening in days. So it was pretty much like first complete shutdown, and then when the reopening started, every state introduced their own guidelines for restarting business. The center introduced changes on health, safety, labor standards, and the companies were required to follow and adhere to this. Now, all of these changes and remote working led to a situation which we've also seen in the past, and I think globally it's recognized that a crisis of this kind creates what we call a fraud triangle, which is basically comprising of three aspects, which is there is a pressure, which is a pressure to commit an anti-corruption, a corrupt payment or a fraud. There is the rationalization construct where whoever commits the fraud would try to justify the decision to commit the fraud, because honestly everybody is just about trying to survive and stay afloat. And there is an opportunity created because of the manner in which most companies and businesses are operating remotely. None of the companies had ever envisaged that they would be working in the manner that they are working today. So the compliance programs, the methodology of working, never envisaged or never provided for working like this, which means everybody is struggling to deal with and get up on their feet. And in the process of just about surviving and keeping themselves afloat, I think everybody's just forgotten to go back and look at issues such as compliance, ethics, and so on and so forth. And consequently, I think it is very evident that the risk of corrupt payments and frauds being committed is extremely high at this given point of time.
Thanks, Alina. You covered both the perspectives of the corruption risks caused by the Indian environment in traditional sense, and also the risks that have emerged because of the COVID. I just want to extend to one of the points, which is more focused towards the increased government interfaces at this point in time across, including the local and central governments. How do you see the government touch points impacting corruption in current times?
A very pertinent question, Sundar. I think given the flurry of regulations, licenses and permits that have been introduced to deal with the lockdown situation and reopening, both at the state level as well as the central level, what has happened is that while majority of the workforce might be working from home, but you still need to, let's say, coordinate logistics movements of either raw material or finished products, or workforce itself who might be coming back to the factories from across different states into where the factories are located. The interaction with the government and government officials to get these licenses and permits would mean that most of the companies are reaching out to intermediaries and consultants across various states to help them get these licenses and permits and to comply with the regulations with minimum supervision on ground, because all of this is happening remotely. Companies may be using intermediaries that they haven't used in the past, and therefore while onboarding or reaching out for such kind of services of intermediaries, they may not get the opportunity to do proper due diligence and verifications of the background of such kind of vendors, consultants and intermediaries. There is not enough time, there are not enough systems in place, and given that this is about survival and restart of business to keep the business afloat, the situation is such that you have but no option to go ahead and use such intermediaries. Now, what happens then is that you're relying on third parties to get these licenses and permits. You don't know what they're doing on ground. You haven't done their background check. You haven't had the time to even subsequently be able to conduct any kind of audits to know what happened on ground. Now, that obviously exposes most companies to a very high risk. There is also the problem that the regulations and requirements for restart of business and licenses and permits is changing very rapidly, and it's different for different states, it's different for the center, and it is becoming increasingly difficult for the companies to stay abreast with these changes, to know exactly what they need to do to comply with these requirements, which again means that they're relying on such third parties who are interfacing on their behalf with government officials to get the various permits, licenses, permissions, and to ensure compliances. And therefore, I think everyone knows that in the Indian context, the highest risk of corruption is the use of intermediaries and third parties. And with no ability to physically do background checks or supervise them, I think the risk is increased exponentially for most businesses.
Absolutely, Alina. I think I can't agree more on those pointers, specifically on those two specific references that you gave on the due diligence, the inability to conduct an extensive due diligence, and also inability to extensively do control validations because of remote working environment. I just want to extend that a little bit. Considering the remote working environment or challenges around lockdown, relaxation, and more specifically the healthcare focus, how do you see this impacting corruption or corruption controls in the current times?
The remote working environment, specifically for the healthcare sector, I think is obviously probably putting things in a different perspective, because here you're talking about procurement of healthcare products, whether it is, pharmacy products, whether it is medical devices like ventilators, whether it is test kits, etc. Since there is an immense urgency to procure this, and most of the healthcare procurement is being done by the government or government-owned hospitals in the country. In the current scenario, there are two aspects I think I would like to highlight. The government procurement is controlled by guidelines that are issued by the government. There is a process that has been prescribed by the government when they do procurement directly, or when hospitals that are owned by the government do procurements. Each one of them has their own procurement manual. Typically, because procurement has been subject of various audits, inspections, and allegations of corruption, usually the procurement process that is followed is a tender process, which is a very time-consuming process. And despite that, there have been instances of allegations of corruption and issues in the procurement process. And I think what is happening now, where you need to procure these supplies on an urgent basis, one cannot expect them to follow the normal procurement process involving a bid, because it's time consuming. But most of the government officials or officials in these government hospitals would be reluctant to use the emergency powers to procure without such processes, because they would be subject to scrutiny subsequently, and there could be allegations of corrupt payouts, of frauds, etc. And therefore, I think a very relevant example as of now would be the procurement that was done by the ICMR in India of the test kits. That became a subject of major scrutiny, where there were allegations that the ICMR paid more or a higher price for procuring those kits from the Chinese manufacturer, and also issues about the quality not being up to the standard, etc. Now, interestingly, what came to light based on media reports was the procurement process that was followed by the ICMR was a bid process, but there were red flags raised on that process itself, saying that they did not give enough time to the bidders, they did not put proper conditions in the process, and therefore that led to a higher price being paid by the government and the quality is being substandard. It also, from a very academic perspective from me, means usually, since they are emergency powers and authorization to government agencies to go and directly procure it without going through a bid process in emergency times, why didn't the ICMR, for example, or any government body not feel it appropriate to exercise those powers and procure directly without having to mandate, for example, that you should procure it from the authorized representative of a foreign equipment manufacturer who may be based in a different country, or do a direct government-to-government procurement, rather than having the requirement of having someone being present in the country as an authorized agent, because that would only mean the number of layers means higher the price. And in a situation like this, where you cannot really do physical bid meetings or physical testing of the qualities, etc., and you're trying to do this as fast as possible because lives of people are questioned, it has created a situation where obviously the allegations of corruption and fraud are going to increase. Procurement will continue to remain probably the highest risk in terms of corruption and fraud, not only from the procurement agency, but also from the supplier's side, where if they do not have adequate controls and checks to deal with the situation, there could be challenges in actually bidding or participating in the supply of these products, because they could become suspect in terms of how they got the procurement orders. And one needs to remember is that if any impropriety is ever discovered, the consequence is blacklisting. from supplying these products or supplying or participating in any bids from the government procurement that would be done subsequently. So I think specifically in the healthcare sector, in the Indian scenario, the challenges are immense, both from the supply side and the demand side.
Absolutely, and I like one of the points that you mentioned, that it's important from a supplier perspective also, if they have controls adequately to manage this circumstance, and it is also obvious to actually look at it from the other side, irrespective of whether there is issues specifically from in terms of conduct in their side. This is going to create a huge reputational impact of getting them involved in certain controversial procurement transactions if they are not able to demonstrate that they have followed adequate process.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that becomes very significant for most companies to remember in these difficult times is the change that has been introduced specifically to the Prevention of Corruption Act in 2019, that mandates that a company needs to have adequate procedures to prevent corruption. That is the only defense a corporate will have if there is any allegation of corruption on the corporate. Now, whilst the new law hasn't really issued the rules or guidelines on what would be construed as adequate procedures, we are still awaiting those. I think it is important for companies to use this opportunity to reassess their compliance programs, identify the risks that are created as a result of the current work environment, which I agree is completely unprecedented, and I don't think any company's compliance program would have catered to this situation. So what they need to do is go back to it, identify the gaps, and try and quickly come up with simple solutions to address these gaps, so that as and when things normalize and as and when regulatory authorities are looking into it, or the auditors discover something and there are red flags or whistleblower complaints, the companies can demonstrate that they had adequate procedures in place even during these difficult times. They did the best that they could to try and prevent corrupt payments from taking place in their companies. And I think it's not a very difficult task. It's just about taking the time to go back to your policies and procedures, examine them in light of the current situation, identify the key points, and suggest simple checks and balances that they can have in a remote working environment to address those issues. That's all it will take to mitigate the risks that a lot of companies are facing in today's time.
Absolutely, Alina. I just there are two more points that I wanted to just check about. The first point is primarily around now that there is a lot of actions that are coming along. Is there a way that we can look at how the enforcement activity is expected in the current times on anti-corruption in Indian context?
I think the fact that the enforcement agencies are active is very clear from what I think all of us are reading in the daily newspapers and hearing on news. From a practitioner's perspective who's dealing in this space, I can tell you that the enforcement environment is extremely active. They continue to emphasize and investigate issues as we speak. And I think it's very clear from the government's perspective, as that it is important for the Indian corporate world to adhere to higher corporate governance standards, to make sure that we do business ethically, even in these challenging times. So we've only seen an increase in the number of cases that are being investigated, even during the lockdown period. And of course, the enforcement agencies are also adapting to the new situation where investigations need to be conducted in a slightly different manner. Remote tools are being adopted to address the risk associated with the health situation. And to my mind, I think based on what I'm seeing, they continue to be active and investigate cases, and they are aware of the risks that are posed by it. But the difference, Sundar, that I would like to make out here between a country like India and, let's say, US, is that the focus in the Indian environment remains to the larger issues and cases that we see, and the enforcement agencies are obviously at the current moment focused on the bigger and the larger issues that are coming up. They do not have the same structure as the US enforcement agencies have. We've heard about how they have set up special task force in the US for every district. Now, while we do not have similar action in India in terms of task force to address the COVID situation, where they are expecting higher instances of fraud and corruption, but at the same time, they are aware that there is higher risk with the number of incentives and programs rolled out by the government. I think the banking sector specifically is going to be prone to a lot of issues, because the government has come up with stimulus packages to be rolled out into the economy for funds to be available. There'll be various companies that are going to be reaching out to the financial institutions to avail of these stimulus packages to keep them afloat during these difficult times. And interestingly, in the Indian context, one needs to remember that even if you're a private bank, an officer of the private bank would be seen as a public official. And therefore, to the extent a company or company officials are dealing with bank officials, it is not a private transaction to that extent, and it falls within the purview of a bribe. And therefore, the risk here, because majority of the SMEs, MSMEs are going to be reaching out for interim stimulus packages to tide over this situation, and therefore the risk here for a corrupt payout is higher, and companies need to be very cautious. So it's not just a stimulus package in the banking and financial sector, but also, businesses trying to deal with the existing loans, the existing banking facilities and credit lines. There is stress. They will not be able to meet their obligations of repayment. So again, the stress there is going to increase. And therefore, I think what COVID situation is creating, that situation while the whole stimulus opening, existing obligations interplay with each other, is higher risk of corruption and fraud.
Absolutely, Alina. So this is, of course, the enforcement scenario is changing, and with all this financial stress, that it's going to further enhance the impact of corruption per se. With that, as we come to the close of the podcast, I just wanted to ask this specific question on how do you see what are the actions that you think the compliance officer can take at this point in time in Indian context?
I think one needs to understand in the Indian context that you're talking about various types of businesses and industries, and you have the small scale industries, you have the medium and industries, and you have the large businesses. Having said that, each of them is required to have a compliance program, and while the level of sophistication and complexity for each one of them would be, let's say, proportionate to the risk each one is exposed to, what the compliance officers need to do at this point of time is a couple of things. First and foremost, reevaluate your risk in these given times. You need to reassess how you're doing business, identify the risk gaps, and accordingly develop appropriate checks and balances to address those risks in this remote business working environment. Immediately after doing that, the next step would be to communicate and train your workforce, your employees, and your intermediaries on those risks and the checks and balances that they need to follow to address those risks. One does not need to make them very complicated or voluminous so that it becomes difficult to follow. I think the compliance officer has to be very prudent in these times and come up with very crisp, crystal clear, simple checks and balances that need to be communicated and reinforced time and again, not just from the compliance officer, but I think it's imperative that the top management also communicates this to the employees and the workforce to say that we understand the pressures that exist in these times. We understand the performance pressures that the employees are facing. We understand the fact that the employees are going to be extremely worried about job security and what's going to happen tomorrow. But to reinforce that in all of these difficulties, and I think most businesses are in the same situation where the survival of the business is at risk, that they need to work together to follow those measures to mitigate the risks that emanate from the current situation. So it's very simple. Identify risks, develop simple checks and policies, communicate and talk, and allow accessibility for your intermediaries, your employees to reach the compliance officer, to call whoever is the relevant person in the organization and say, okay, I have a problem and I don't know how to deal with it. Please advise. They should not be in a remote environment feeling that they are isolated and that they need to take a decision on their own and do something that could obviously impact the reputation of the business and the employee, but at the same time also lead to very severe consequences going forward. And clearly, while those would come out only subsequently, the ramifications of these are going to be immense. So I think simple steps and should be done by most companies and compliance officers on a priority basis.
Absolutely. Essential checks and balances, tone at the top and integrating it with the supply chain, specifically the intermediaries, are definitely useful tips in this context. Alina, I thank you for joining this podcast and sharing insights on anti-bribery corruption environment in Indian context. I look forward connecting with you again.
Thank you so much, Sundar, for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.